Today we're going to look at creating some routes so that we can push a second screen onto our existing screen. What we're going to do is make up the transactions list. So your current screen is an account list and it has 2 accounts on there. And what we're going to do when we have this screen is when you click on one of your accounts, it'll show up a list of transactions. And just for completeness, we're also going to create an empty state. So if there is an account that doesn't have any transactions, then it'll display some text that says no transactions. And this is the first look really at doing something where we have more than one screen or where the screen's kind of going to change. So this is the screen that we've got so far, and basically what we want to do is click on here, and when we click on that screen, that'll take us to the transaction screen. So first of all, I'm just going to do a little bit of tidying up. I'm going to create a new folder, and that folder will be called Screens. And I'm going to take all of this data, and I'm going to create a new Dart file called home screen.dart. And I'm going to need all of that up here. And then if we go back to main, I'm now going to need to import the home page. So that should run as before. And the next thing we're going to do is add routes. So there's a couple of different ways to do it, and this isn't the simplest one, but this is the one that we're going to go for because we're very quickly going to need some routes that have arguments that need to be passed between them. So I'm going to do an onGenerateRoute, which is a function. And that route needs to return something called a material page route. So I'm going to make it return a material page route. And that builder for now is going to return my home page in all circumstances. So everything's still the same. So next thing that we're going to do is if settings.name. So these are the name arguments, and it actually works quite similar to how you'd see web pages and how you'd handle a route in that sense. So our default route is going to be /, and we're going to explicitly say this. Our initial route is going to be /. And what we'll do is we'll basically capture a widget that will change depending on the home screen. So I'm going to have it so that if it's the home page, then the widget we pass through is that. And again, I'll just run it to check that I haven't broken anything, and it still looks good to me. So it's a pretty easy thing here if we just test what happens if we change the route to something else. So we're still on initial route. If I change that to something else, now when it hits this condition, it's not going to hit this one, it should hit the second one. And we can see it says hello world. We're back to that black screen, and that's basically because we don't have a scaffold around it. So if we add a scaffold and a body, and an app bar, and reload, should hit that hello world thing. And what it's actually done is it's pushed that route on for us. And when it does that, it creates the back button for us automatically. So I'm just going to stick back to the initial root idea for now, and I'm going to add some data from my GitHub page. So if we go to lesson 4, I'll put the link in for this in with this video. But on this page is the complete solution, so you can check your data as well. And I'm just going to copy this class here, just for ease, and I'm going to call it transaction data. And it's another fairly simple class. There's not a lot to it. Essentially, a transaction needs 3 things. It has 3 finals, and the rest can be null. I'm going to set the amount, the type, and the date. So this is sending and receiving, and that's the function that we're going to create with some mock data in it. We're also just going to change account data so that this takes a list of transaction. And we're going to make it so that our first has the mock transactions and our second has no transactions, so an empty array. Hopefully that should all make sense. Obviously, go and check it out on GitHub and have a little look at what I've done here if you're not confused, but it's nothing complicated. So back to this, so we're obviously going to need to create a new screen to show this transaction list. I'm going to call it transaction list screen. I'm going to add another stateless widget and call it transaction list screen and import widgets. In fact, I'm going to import material, because we will need to immediately add a scaffold. And I've, as usual, incorrectly named the file, so I'll just rename that. And I'm going to add to my container a text field that says hello world, because I'm obsessed with making hello worlds. So what I'm going to do now is make it that if the settings equals details, that I return a transaction list. And into this transaction list screen, I'm going to make it take a list of transactions, create a constructor, and make that a list of transactions required. So here's the first step for us. So I'm just going to go back to changing my initial root to details. And this just helps with testing, and we're back to having hello world. Now scaffold. I'm going to add an app bar, and that's added an app bar. And again, it's past the back button as well. If it's not slash, then that's why it's going straight to that screen. So it will go back to the root which has a slash in it. Cool. So transactions is required, and we're not passing it in, which is a fair point. If we pass in an empty array, we'll at least get rid of the compiler warning, and it's going to give us the same thing. And the first thing that we're going to do is handle if there's an empty an empty body state. So what we'll do is we'll keep the container and we'll say if the transactions is empty, then our widget, I'm going to use the similar syntax as before, our widget is a text which says you don't have any transactions for this account. Fairly straightforward. And so if we pass that widget in as a child, rerun, I think it's gone into a bit of a funny state. So I'll just rerun that. So we're going to do something to center that as well, and classically we've got a center widget. Let's have a look at that. So let's put it in the center. Another thing, I'm going to use some more themes. So I'm going to use a text style theme of context.text theme dot, let's try it with the title. Great, you don't have any transactions for this account. Text align should be centered. That's good to me. I think it would be better if there was a little bit of padding around the side as well. Set to 8, maybe a bit more than that. Perfect, you don't have any transactions for this account. So let's see what we can do if there are any transactions. I'm going to create a new widget here called transaction list item, and that is going to take a transaction and that transaction again is required, and we will just make it return the amount. And just for fun, I'm going to text style that one as well. And if we run back over to have a look, we'll see nothing because it's not in there yet. So if we switch on over to main, and just for now we'll pass in our mock transactions list and rerun. Interestingly, we can see on the side that the text is actually showing the home page. So let's just use another thing that we learned in the last lesson. So we're going to make it a list view of transactions, and the children are going to be a mapped version of these transactions.map. So obviously the word transaction is in there 3 times, so we're creating a little function where the transaction is being passed in and converted for each transaction type. we're going to end up with a transaction list item. So let's go and have a look at how that looks. Not great because it's saying 5 at the side. I'm just going to center it for now. We can see them being listed one by one. And I'm just going to add a little bit of padding, particularly to the top. And it's something like that. So I'm not going to focus too much in this lesson on the list view itself. I would prefer to focus on the actual roots. So if we go back to our main.dart, we've actually kind of cut out a bit of a thing in the middle, and we're not passing in the mock transaction. So let's first of all correct that. When I first started this tutorial, I said that we were using onGenerateRoot, which is not the simplest way of generating root information, but we wanted to extract some arguments, because what we're going to do when we push the root on is pass a list of transactions. So what we'll do here now is take the settings.arguments, and we're going to have to make those get pushed in from the account details. And for now as well, we're just going to switch back to the initial root so that we can see our initial list of accounts, which looks good to me. So what I want to do now is change the home page so that we end up with an on-click listener. So around each individual card item, what I'm going to do is wrap a new widget around it, and I'm going to wrap it with a gesture detector. And I'm going to add an onTap function. This onTap function is going to call navigator.of context.push named, and it's going to push detail. And it's going to pass as an argument account data transactions. So it's a fairly straightforward and I've forgotten to call it the right thing here, so arguments, so it's complaining at me. It's a fairly simple thing. We've wrapped the whole thing in a gesture detector, and that basically means that it or all of its children, when they're tapped, then it will perform the onTap function, and that is going to execute this little shorthand function. Again, it's just like this, but a more succinct way of writing it. And that is going to get the navigator that's in the root. So if we pass in a different navigator in the thing above it, it would have a different thing. In this case, it's going to go all the way up to the material app and call that navigator. And we're going to push in named, so we're going to push /detail, and we're going to pass the arguments account data.transactions. So now if I press this, the builder for root return null. Interesting. Why is that? Detail. And I'm passing details. So there's actually been a typo here, which leads me on very nicely to my next point. It's already getting to a point where I've got the same string in two different places, although as it happens I didn't type it correctly, which means I don't. So what I prefer to do is create a screens folder and have each of the roots defined in there. So home screen, and they can all be const strings. And I'm also going to have detail screen, which is going to be called details. In my detail screen, I'm going to have, in my home screen even, when I push it on there here now, I'm going to call it detail screen. And similarly in main.dart, I'm going to change this to refer to the static object. if we rerun it. So the second account, if you remember rightly, doesn't have any transactions, so we still get that empty data state, whereas the first transactions has our pretty underwhelming transactions UI. So one other thing I'm going to change is the screen state, the transactions screen will in fact want to know a little bit about the account type. So it's going to want to know that it's a Bitcoin and the provider for the account. So rather than just passing in the transaction data, I'm going to go through and pass in to the screen an account data. So it's all the same logic below that, and then obviously I'm also going to have to change the home screen so that it doesn't pass in transactions, it passes in account data. Now we've got an error here because I've now named it account data instead. Cool. Minor refactor, and it all seems to be working fine. The final thing I'm going to do before ending this lesson is change this gesture detector, because there's actually something nice that we can do called an inkwell. And it also has an on-tap function, so you can kind of get away with replacing the gesture detector. And what it means is that when we click on it, we get this inkwell look. And you might notice, a little bit is actually happening behind the card view. And that allows me to show you this little function here. So you can do swap with parent, and that means that the inkwell is now below the card view, as in the inkwell and the card view has swapped with its parent. And if you look now, you can see the inkwell on there. The color for that is actually set in our theme. So we can change it here. Splash color, I think it is. And you can see now that that is also red. In fact, I think that's a little bit too red, so I'm going to make it red accent. And it's just a nice little touch. So there you have the end of lesson 4. Thanks very much again for watching, and stay tuned for the next lesson, where for this next lesson we're going to look at changing from one screen to another with an animation, and we're going to make that transaction list look a little bit nicer than it already does. Thanks for watching.